Guys, I'm joined by Don Dahlman. Don, how are you doing today?
Hi, Nicole. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm pretty good. So, you and I just spent the past few hours digging into aftermarket.
Yes.
Now, this isn't something that I would have assumed that I would be so interested in, to be honest, because in my automotive history, aftermarket usually means like a guy with a Civic souping up his car.
Yeah, but it's a bit more complicated.
It's a lot more complicated.
We have a lot of trends now, or a lot of changes going on in the automotive industry, like digitalization, big data, electrification, autonomous driving. And this is all part of the aftermarket. And today we watched a presentation from ZF where they showed what they are doing in all of these fields.
And ZF Aftermarket is, I guess, almost trying to compete or trying to enable an interesting segment within the OEMs, which I find very interesting. So when BMW, say, releases a car and you have the option to have four-wheel drive, but you didn't decide to buy that, you could purchase it afterwards. And then through software, you could maybe unlock that feature. Or, like we're hearing from a lot of manufacturers, you could decide to pay for autonomous drive or level
Exactly.
four,
Yeah,
right? So these features are stuff that we're now looking at as aftermarket sale from OEMs, where the ZF aftermarket also deals with workshops and repair shops.
Yeah, they do a bit more, and I found it very interesting what they said in their first statements in the stream today, because they were very clear about that the transformation is accelerating, and they said like things that we thought would happen in 2025 are actually happening now, and who will not connect to these changes and transformation, this company will lose out. And they also said that the mobility itself is changing. It's not about cars anymore. And they said like apps will rule the mobility.
I really enjoyed the fact that when it comes to a tier one, like a supplier that's supplying all the car brands that we know, that they had such a forward thinking way of presenting their whole ecosystem.
Right. But there's also like a lot of pressure for those companies. I mean, ZF was also talking to one expert called Bill Russo, who was an expert like for the Epic market, and he clearly, or he made it clear that China is like the forerunner in digitalization. They talked about banking and payment systems. Like literally everything in China is now digital. You need your phone to pay things, no credit card or no like cash or so. It's like last century or something like that. So China is pressing forward with that, and I think that adds a lot of pressure to the OEMs and also of course to the tier ones.
And I found it very interesting that ZF's leadership team in China hasn't touched, paper currency in a couple of years. Like this from German executives in like here in Germany, there's still this love of paper money, right? And I'm always still very surprised by that.
Yeah.
But and it's very true, right? Digitalization in all of its ways. I found very interesting that Germany isn't as like thought leadership as some of the other like leading nations. China has 100% embraced digital currency, and I like that we're seeing a lot of these themes in ZF's presentation. So kind of showing that they are really embracing the forefront.
They're understanding it. They're understanding what's happening there, and I like the way that they're thinking forward, also in terms of what can be interesting for consumers and customers in the next days or in the next years. They're not thinking about like what would we do now, but what kind of business we're going to do like in 10 years or in 15 years. And they see the electromobility and the e-car market as one vital part of their strategy, which is, I mean, which is clear for them. But I mean, if you hear them, they talked about like they have 50 billion euros in the e-market alone for ZF. That's a lot of money.
And one other thing that I really enjoyed hearing about was their move towards this TRW electric blue pads, right? So when we look at electric cars, we kind of have to change the way that we think about braking because there's a lot of regenerative braking. So the brakes will glass over and the discs will corrode because they're not getting enough use, right? And so there's all of these ways that we have to rethink about automotive parts. And ZF was one of the first to come out with this kind of just for electric car brake pads. And the fact that they were also made with 100% green energy, I think was also incredibly forward thinking.
Yeah, it's these kind of thinking that I think a tier one needs today, like to be really thinking about, okay, we have now brakes and brakes are not going to be used anymore that much. How can we solve this problem? Also make braking less noiseless, which the blue pads also do apparently. So this is one example. Another example which I found really interesting was the Etrofit, which is called, like, they retrofit electric engine into old buses that have internal combustion engines. So they can actually, you can go, you have a 10-year or 15-year-old bus that runs your public transport. You can go there and you can retrofit it with an e-drive, which is also like helping to reduce the CO2 emissions, because it made cheaper to retrofit your old bus with an e-drive than buying a new one.
I think when we look at sustainability and how we're going to be moving towards the zero emission future, we need to start looking at, because like when you're a kid, it's reduce, reuse, recycle, right? Those are the three things, the kind of pillars of how we go green. And repairing our cars and not buying new ones is, obviously we all do that because our cars break. But if we think about keeping our cars for much, much longer, ZF had showed this really cool video of this kind of junkyard just full of like parts. And then they had a little, camera hut, I guess, and they put the part in onto white paper, and then it would scan it. So they could scan, I think it was around 5 or 6 thousand parts, and
Mhm.
then identify the serial numbers. So then they have to know the composition, how they can repair it, how can they clean it, what should they reglaze it with. So it was really about taking all of this old stuff that before we would never be able to reuse because we wouldn't be able to identify what it was.
Yeah, exactly. They say 50,000 tons of CO2, they say, just in one factory. So it's like, that's a lot. And that shows you that, we have to have new ways of thinking how we can save CO2, and spare part recycling is certainly one major part for that. And that leads also, like, how they deal with workshops, because the spare parts that you recycle are going into the workshops. And how is a workshop in the next how will a workshop in the next 10 years will survive this digitalization?
Yeah, we saw them talking about something called ProTech, which is just basically access to a whole bunch of information. So tutorials on how to repair these increasingly complex and technologically advanced cars, and access like numbers to access manufacturers, stats on torque, because electric cars tend to be a lot harder on some of the parts, even though there are less for repair. And I also found it interesting that when they were looking at their workshops, that yeah, electric cars actually will, get rid of things like oil changes. So these singular moments of repairing the car will be gone, where it will switch to more component replacement. So like there's all of these evolutions in how we're going to be repairing our cars, and ZF is actually trying to fill that gap between the people on the ground fixing your cars and all of the suppliers and manufacturers and all of the data that the people who are really doing the work need to access.
The ProTech is one interesting thing because it's also looking forward. They try to establish a database where you just can look up, like, what is this part? How do I change it? Sometimes it's more complicated with e-cars. So I think this is like a lot of forward thinking. And the general feeling I had after the first day of the ZF stream, aftermarket stream, was that they have a better understanding of the future compared to some OEMs that we spoke up to, like, for example, last week at the IAA.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that's where a lot of my negativity around Germany was coming from, attending the IAA and kind of hearing all of these like not quite forward thinking enough statements. So it was very refreshing to sit in the ZF aftermarket session to learn more about that. Don, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks a lot, Nicole. And we're going to be back tomorrow with the second day of the ZF Aftermarket streams.
Exactly. See you guys soon.
Bye
Bye.
bye.